Welcome everyone to the June 2021 Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership webinar. My name is Joel Larson and I am the Associate Director at the University of Minnesota's Water Resources Center. Today we are joined by Meredith Cornett, but before I introduce her and turn things over, I wanted to share a few logistical announcements. For this webinar, Meredith will talk for about 30 to 45 minutes, and we will spend the remainder of the time in the Q&A. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and add those at the box using the prompt at the bottom of the screen here that should show up for you. In addition, all participants are muted, but you can ask questions in that Q&A button, or you can upvote other questions that you would like to see asked. We are recording this and we are planning to post it online at a later date, and we'll send an announcement about when that recording is available to our MCAP email list that I'll link to at the end of the presentation. And then also at the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to a brief evaluation. If you've been to these before, you might have filled one out already. But if you haven't yet, your feedback is very helpful to help inform us about other webinar topics and ensure that we're providing you all with the best information that we can. So it should just take about 5 minutes, and we appreciate you taking a little bit of time to do that. So now getting to the good stuff and the reason that you're here, it's my pleasure to introduce Meredith, who will be talking about adaptation and natural climate solutions for Minnesota. Meredith is the Science Director and Climate Lead for the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. In addition to her position with the Nature Conservancy, she is an adjunct member of the graduate faculty in Forest Resources and Conservation Sciences at the University of Minnesota. And her expertise lies in climate change, forest ecology, restoration, and science communications. Meredith's current work at the Conservancy is focused on natural climate solutions, and she and her family live in the North Woods of Minnesota, where they tend beehives, harvest sunlight, and coexist with neighbors, both tame and wild. It's also my pleasure to share that she's the recipient of the 2021 Minnesota Climate Adaptation Award in the individual category. So congratulations again, Meredith, for that. And we are very excited to hear more about her work. So I will turn things over to you, Meredith, and thank you again for joining us.
Great, thank you so much, Joel, for the invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. It's some time to actually talk through some of the projects we've been working on over the last 10 years or so since we entered the adaptation realm. I'm going to share my screen and go to my opening slide here. Hopefully everything is showing up as it should. Great. So it's been a real pleasure for me to think through how I want to talk about all of this work kind of in one comprehensive presentation. I don't want to go too deep on any one topic because I really did want to give an overview and to show the arc of how our climate adaptation work at the Nature Conservancy here in the local chapter has evolved over time. A lot of these developments are very recent, so you'll get a feel for that. But before I go any further, I really want to give a land acknowledgement. And this is something that I am gaining a little bit of experience in and practicing with this group here today, but I'm actually not in my North Woods neighborhood today. I'm in Washington, DC. I'm here to visit my mom for a few days. And I want to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Nacotchunk or the Anacostans, who actually made their home here up until European colonization on Capitol Hill. And I am not very far from there right now. So I've circled that here on John Smith's historical map of Virginia, with many of the tribal nations highlighted here. And many of the descendants of the Anacostans are now living on in the Pamunkey and Piscataway tribes here in the DC mid-Atlantic area. This is a tribal village that was really decimated at the time of colonization with what we know are the plagues and the war and the enslavement and all of the trauma around that time. There's great information from the American Library Association on Indigenous tribes of the Washington, DC area, and a new app that I'm going to be using while I'm here called the Guide to Indigenous DC, with many, many different landmarks around the city, including the site of the Indigenous Peoples March back in 2019. So there's a rich history here to be learned amidst all the traditional tourist attractions that most of us haven't had our eyes open to in previous visits to the area. What I'm going to do today is share some stories and results in 4 different parts. The first of which is the biggest chunk, that's the number 1 part, Climate Adaptation 1.0. 3 different projects. I want to then pivot and talk a little bit about natural climate solutions, the mitigation side of what nature can do for us in this time of a climate crisis. Look at justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as areas that we have overlooked, and at our own expense and the expense of many, many other communities, and make a call for bringing all of these elements together in our adaptation and mitigation work. And then take a look at how we move forward together with 4 examples of projects that the Nature Conservancy has coming online in the near future. Okay, so taking a look at Adaptation 1.0, this is the longest part, and it's only because this is the work that we've been doing for the last 10 years. So there's more to say. And before I get going, I want to talk about some foundational partners that have been at our side the entire time that we have been grappling with the topic of adaptation as more traditional sort of biodiversity practitioners at the Nature Conservancy for some time. So Julie Ederson, Dr. Jill Hamilton, who was with North Dakota State University, moving on to Penn State, Stephen Handler and the whole NIAX crew, and then also Liz Tully with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And all 3 of these projects have been funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. So this is just a tremendous resource for us. There are so many other partners that have taken leadership roles in both the forest and the grassland side of this work. I want to acknowledge them, and I'm recognizing that there may be some that I'm forgetting to thank here, but it has very much been a collective effort. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is this great new paper that came out earlier this year. This is the Wildlife Conservation Society's work. And what they've done is pulled together all of the different frameworks for thinking about adaptation as a continuum from resistance all the way up to transformation. And they have put all of the projects that they've funded into that new framework. So we've seen versions of this over time, but I really like the way this has been pulled together. And the nice thing is that the 3 projects I'm talking about can be placed on this chart. So you can see that there is this upward trend from way back in 2011 when they started the fund, really more projects that were sort of in this active resistance mode, trying to keep things the same in natural habitats and wildlife areas as they were historically, and the focus was on trying to keep that, keep things in check. And then there's been this transition towards more of a transformational way, trying to help nature adapt to climate change by putting more of the pieces in place to experience the transformation of a community from one state to another. So we won't go deeply into these definitions, but I just wanted to place our projects along this continuum. And in 2012, I'm told that we were an outlier. So we had a directed transformation project way back in the day. And we have always kind of hovered around in the transformation space, but occasionally drifting more towards resilience. You'll see what I mean here in a moment, but a really great paper if you haven't had a chance to check it out yet. And I want to give a huge shout out to two of my closest colleagues at the Nature Conservancy, Mark White, who's provided a ton of thought leadership in the forest realm, and then Marissa Allering, who has also been a great leader for our grassland adaptation work. Before I go into these three projects, I want to give a tiny bit of background because this was a watershed moment for us as an organization. Thinking back to 2010, this was about the time that we started to grapple with the fact that what we had been trying to do, which was to restore the historical diversity, mostly long-lived boreal conifer species to the Northwoods of Minnesota, that was not necessarily going to be a strategy that had staying power in a changing climate. Restoring historical forest composition to a climate that was rapidly warming was probably not going to be a sustainable strategy for us. That was really a moment of reckoning for us, and Mark White was at the forefront of that thinking, along with our partners from Portland State University and University of Wisconsin-Madison. This is an ecological applications paper that came out at the time, mostly based on modeling. And we were finding that as we tried to grow this forest out, northeastern Minnesota forest, and under different climate scenarios, we really were not able to have the influence using all of the tricks that we were applying up to that point with our traditional restoration practices. And in fact, we were seeing, no matter how hard we tried to push the forest, really this transition to a fairly homogeneous, mostly sugar maple and red maple dominated landscape. That's what our model was telling us. We didn't have the proof at that point based on any field trials. But one of the big conclusions from the paper was that facilitation of species transitions may be the most effective means of maintaining ecosystems, even if not in the same location. So this is sort of the precursor to our first couple of forest projects in the adaptation realm. And this is all against the backdrop of, in Northeast Minnesota, one of the hot spots for warming in North America, looking at 1.4 to 1.9 degrees Celsius temperature change already, and less water availability during the growing season. And so just a big bullseye basically over Northeast Minnesota. So again, our two forest projects, one is called Adaptation Forestry. I'll talk about that one first, and then move into the conifer strongholds example. I think what happened with that realization about how the landscape was just transforming despite all of our efforts to have some management influence over it in this climate change era, we decided that we needed to try some pretty drastic things for the time. And so that is where the Adaptation Forestry Project came from. This is basically assisted migration of populations of northern forest tree species. And the idea is looking at one of the great tools available to us, the Climate Change Tree Atlas. Northern species like white spruce, which we love to plant because they're one of the ones that the deer don't go for as much, and we don't need to protect them as much from the ravages of deer browsing, seem to be losing ground under modeled climate change scenarios. And so drawing on species that have a wider range, like red oak and bur oak, that are native to northern Minnesota but may not be as common, could be a way for us to help build some diversity into the forests of the future. There are some problems with this, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But our basic hypothesis, and this is work done with Dr. Julie Ederson, was that the local temperate ecotypes may already be maladapted to the current climate. So we wanted to try not only these species with a broader range of tolerances, but also potentially pulling on ecotypes that originated further to the south of the range. So we did a formal experimental design. We planted red and bur oak, taking some from the local seed zone, some from one seed zone south, and we planted more than 100,000 trees in this design, but we are keeping track of them indefinitely at 16 sites and 3,000 different tree seedlings. This is a paper that came out in Ecological Applications about a year ago, and I'm just going to share some of the highlights from the results. And keep in mind that this was a kind of a major undertaking with lots and lots of partners and field workers and resources. It had a huge carbon footprint in and of itself. And that we are not going to have the ability to do this with all of the tree species that we are interested in potentially incorporating into our adaptation plans. And so we'll need to streamline this work in the future, but this was kind of our first go at it. So we gave it everything we had with the help of the Wildlife Conservation Society. So here's the paper, and here are the results. So we have just the highlights here. So it's worth spending a little time with this slide because there's a lot going on. So the three panels represent three of our key areas, three key results. Survival at the top, how long each plant retained its leaves in the middle, and then leaf thickness at the bottom. Bur oak is on the left-hand side of all three of those panels, and red oak is on the right. And then we have northern and southern ecotypes within each of those. So what we found was that the southern seed source overall, this is the top panel, had higher survival, also retained its leaves longer into the fall, and that's the middle panel, and had thicker leaves or lower specific leaf area. I know that's a little bit of a confusing term, but natural selection was favoring the southern traits overall. So based on these results, we were thinking about what the management implications are, and there's been a lot of discussion recently about state and federal recommendations for seed zones, seed sourcing for adaptation and restoration projects. And based on the past climate, which is really no longer appropriate, we're suggesting that flexible seed zones may be the way to go for many, many species that may be part of adaptation projects. So that's in a nutshell, that first project, adaptation forestry. Thinking a little bit though about the northern conifers in the landscape, the boreal species that we didn't feel good about just giving up on. Are we really going to try to transition to more of a temperate forest scenario just to keep the forest in forest, or is there some hope that we could retain some of these northern conifers on the landscape? So that's what we tested with this second project starting in 2016. And in this case, our hypothesis was that planting boreal conifers on sites with higher landscape diversity and cooler temperatures, what we are calling resilient sites, would result in higher survival and growth of the seedlings that are on resilient sites versus sites that are just planted more opportunistically. And here, Mark White came up with a scheme that said that if we look at landscapes, compare landscapes with high and low diversity and in combination with high and low temperatures, relatively speaking, throughout the region, that we should see growth and survival do a little bit better in those sites with high landscape diversity, lots of options, and lower rates of warming overall. So we do not have results to share with you right now, except to say that more than 160,000 seedlings were planted for this project in 2018 and 2019. That was under the supervision of Chris Dunham, our amazing resilience forestry manager. And just as a fun fact about Chris and his crews, this year they planted more than 1 million tree seedlings. So they're really doing some amazing work in northern Minnesota. We are hoping to get back out in 2022 to remeasure these seedlings. So you can see we've got a number of different sites that represent 4 different resilience classes, and then 50 permanent monitoring plots on 4 research and natural areas on the Superior National Forest that serve as controls to show how the regeneration is doing on unmanaged sites. So this is an active project. There's a paper out with Mark White as the lead author that compares these 2 projects and talks about the huge importance that partnerships played, including Katie Frecker, the forest ecologist on the Superior. And then finally, my last sort of project that we have under our belts right now is this diverse seed sourcing strategy for grasslands. I'll spend a few minutes talking about that. It had its whole own sort of diverse team that was responsible for getting all of the seed collection and seeding done. Just an amazing effort led by Marissa Allering. And the hypothesis in this case was that mixing source populations of seeds for restorations will increase genetic variability and the success of native forb populations as measured by their establishment and their productivity. And so this is sort of pushing back on that idea that local seed source is always best and pulling from some of the best thinking about genetic diversity in grasslands that doesn't necessarily say, oh, just draw from the south, but to get as many different propagules out there from as many different sources as possible, which is the direction the literature is pointing us. So I want to give you a feel for the scope geographically of this work. 3 different states and 6 different landscapes. And then the red dot here in the middle of the Missouri Coteau in South Dakota is our Ordway Prairie Preserve. And that's where Marissa and team have set up some study plots to look at the seed mixes with diverse seed sourcing versus those that hail from just the most local populations. And we're really excited about some of the products from this work. So first of all, they managed to get 900 acres planted. They planned on 600, so they really knocked this one out of the park. And mapped 31,000 populations. This is with the help of Nina Hill, our science fellow. 320 different prairie plant species in those populations. So these are the maps. And then this has been part of creating a tool for assembling genetically diverse seed mixes that can be used by any of our partners. We've engaged some agency partners already who may be interested in adopting some of these practices. But now we have the mapped locations for all of these species, so we can go back and collect again, try this again in other places. It's just a really exciting body of work. And actually, a lot of this is captured on our website under the Adaptation tab. So we're going to move along now. So that was a big chunk. I want to talk now about natural climate solutions, and it's every bit as important to our tackling climate work here in the local chapter and around the world at the Nature Conservancy as the adaptation piece. So we know that to keep global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has been agreed by many, many scientists and leading organizations that we must keep warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the most extreme impacts of climate change. We need to draw down on the order of 30 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, every year. This is to reach that very basic goal. And 1 gigaton is equivalent to approximately 100 million elephants, which is enough elephants to stretch from Earth to the moon. So that's just to try to give you a little bit of a visual for this very big number that most of us aren't used to thinking about. Numbers quite that big. So we know that a huge part of getting there will be clean energy, but we also know that that alone will not be enough to do what we need to do. The rest needs to be made up using the power of nature. And I want to share just a couple of things that make that point. This is coming from one of the foundational papers for natural climate solutions. In 2017, this work came out, published by the Nature Conservancy and 15 other organizations. Bronson Griscom is the lead author. So really what this graph is showing is that we need to cut our emissions in half by 2030. And this is what our current administration is saying as well in the IPCC. And we need to get to net zero by 2050. So if we continue on our current trajectory, business as usual, we clearly don't reach that goal. If we can turn around and invest in renewables, that's great, but we're still going to need the drawdown that can be provided by natural and working lands. And that's the green, the sequestration involved with managing and restoring ecosystems, and then also preventing them from being converted in the first place. And that gives us up to 37% of what we need to achieve. I always like to underscore that this is all due to photosynthesis. Oftentimes that just doesn't get said, but the amazing process by which plants convert carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates using the energy from the sun, and breathe out oxygen for the rest of us to breathe in. And if you get enough plants doing that, you can make a real difference. The other reason that we love natural climate solutions at the Nature Conservancy, in addition to this very elegant thing that they can do for solving the climate crisis, is all the other natural benefits that they convey while they do this. In the US, the picture looks a little bit different than it does for the globe. We are about 79% of our drawdown or emissions avoidance needs to come from a transition to renewable energy. And the other 21% can come from natural climate solutions. So let's take a look at what that means in Minnesota. The beauty of natural climate solutions is that all of these practices, for those of you who work in natural resources, are going to look pretty familiar. If you're in agriculture, you've probably already heard about cover cropping and improved nutrient management and reduced tillage. You look at our biggest bar, reforestation, improved forest management. These are things that sound familiar to us. Wetland restoration and avoided peatland conversion, grassland restoration. These are all things that we do. We just need to figure out a way very quickly to do a lot more of them to maximize our contribution to this overall drawdown that we need to keep warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. In Minnesota, that number is 26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year we need to get to by 2030 for that cutting in half of our emissions. And that's about the equivalent of taking close to 7 coal-fired power plants offline. So that's the whole suite of what we can do for natural climate solutions in Minnesota. And I want to just call out here the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, fondly referred to by many of us as NIACS, because they have figured out a way with the menus that they offer for adaptation to bring together the need for mitigation as well as adaptation in their forest carbon management menu. And a shout out to Todd Ontel, who is one of the leads behind this work, which can really help us think about how to maximize the drawdown, in addition to how we help these ecosystems adapt. Because truly, if we're not thinking about how we're helping them adapt, then we won't have anything left, of course, to perform those drawdown functions. So, checking my time here. Okay, doing pretty well. Got a few more things to share, but just to sort of summarize the natural climate solutions piece, nature can provide roughly a third of the solution to this overall climate crisis. We have photosynthesis to thank for that. And then we also need to be thinking about both adaptation and mitigation together to reach those goals. And on our website, you will also find this report, Nature and Climate Solutions for Minnesota, which was produced by Sachi Graber in conjunction with our science team, and is available for download if you want to dig into more about natural climate solutions in Minnesota. So I want to point out some things that, that are genuinely shortcomings for our work here in Minnesota. And I want to do this just because I think it's an important part of improving. And I really don't want to beat ourselves up about it. And I also really do want to do a better job. Like many organizations, the Nature Conservancy has been thinking about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And that is for a variety of reasons. And I want to share a comment from Dudley Edmondson, who put together this beautiful blog post on nature.org, our big splashy website. Dudley is an ornithologist and videographer, photographer, writer who lives in Duluth. And he wrote this piece just about a year ago. And I think that what he says here is worth quoting. Organizations that work on conservation and the environment are too often predominantly white in their leadership, staffing, and membership. The Nature Conservancy is no exception. They must realize that African Americans and other people of color are essential to their present and future success. The piece is very rich, it's very beautiful. I really encourage, if you haven't already read it, please check it out. And this is something that we are definitely trying to come to terms with. And this was not even a year ago, so we don't have it all figured out yet. And I think a lot of us are trying to find our way here. So I want to share some glimmerings of hope in our work and also talk about some of the work coming online that where we're trying to build in this this thinking and this partnership from the ground up with our new projects. I gave an early mention of our Trees, Water, Soil campaign. This is a storytelling campaign where we are talking to Minnesotans across all sectors, across all demographics, to really share our stories about climate change and how we're posing solutions. So on the Trees, Water, Soil site, you will find a number of these pieces already up. There are more videos that will be posted soon. And I wanted to just share with you this team from Blackbird Revolt. This is an African-American owned and African-American staffed creative firm. And Jordan Moses here, second from the right, is one of the principal owners. And Dudley Edmondson as well as part of this team. So this is a group of people who are really helping us to think through inclusiveness and justice, and how we do a better job talking about some of the sides of conservation that have really not been super proud parts of our history. So figuring out how to move ahead. I want to just give a huge plug for this amazing resource, the Tribal Adaptation Menu. Many of us have been using this resource, which is one of the first communications of its kind. The beautiful design on the cover. Here, I want to just read a little bit about that in a moment. But this is kind of the go-to reference right now for how to develop culturally appropriate climate adaptation actions, and a chance for many of us to reflect on how our adaptation actions haven't really taken this into account in the past. I want to give a couple of examples. First of all, sugar maple, very culturally important species, and it's the monoculture of sugar maple that kind of popped up in our computer models that made us really worry. We want to keep sugar maple on the landscape, and that in and of itself could be a very important goal, which I think, for example, the 1854 Treaty Authority has identified it that way. Or planting oaks, as I have learned recently, in moose range is potentially a really bad idea, because it's something that could possibly encourage white-tailed deer populations to grow, and that could be a real problem for moose, spreading brainworm to moose. So this gorgeous design represents the Ojibwe clans and their role in caring about the earth. There's a lot more to learn about this design if you get a copy of the report and just look at the credits. So there's a whole menu of approaches that do a better job of incorporating cultural practices and traditional knowledge. And this is something that we all need to be trying to do from here on out. And I'm just thankful that we have a tool to do it at this point. So moving forward, I'm going to just mention a couple of projects briefly, and then we'll go to questions here. 4 different projects that we're embarking on. One is called the Minnesota Million. This is a reforestation project. We're trying to bring together a coalition that includes all Minnesotans, and we'll start to really get some traction on planting portions of our forests back. There's been a great technical team that's been helping us figure out the logistics of that, helping us understand existing programs to work with private landowners. And we're trying right now to build a community engagement team that can really bring a diversity of thinking and partners into this realm. The impetus for a lot of this was a new tool the Nature Conservancy has out on line, the Reforestation Hub. So feel free to check that out, but it identified roughly actually 3 million acres of opportunity in Minnesota to restore forest cover. So what are the best places to do that that could potentially help reforest in places where people have been most impacted by deforestation in negative ways? How do we incorporate environmental justice principles into this work? We've been working to refine the national data sets, but then how do we build in culturally appropriate species selection so that this reflects the values of the communities where the work is actually happening? There's a lot to be figured out here, and a lot potentially of economic benefit in terms of jobs and markets, et cetera. We have a real problem. If we want to plant 1 million acres of trees back in Minnesota, we don't actually have the nursery capacity to do that. So how are we going to enhance that capacity And one way that's being proposed and tested right now is by engaging farmers in rural Minnesota in growing out some of the seedlings. This is through the so-called assisted migration project. It involves UMD. Right now we have 15 farms throughout the region that are participating in growing out the seedlings that are being produced from seeds collected in more southerly parts of the state. And we hope to bring many, many more farmers online. Also taking a look at how we can harvest wild rice as a climate adaptation and resilience strategy. This is a brand new project funded by NOAA. I think not everything is finalized yet, but this draws on one of the aspects of the tribal adaptation menu where we can actually maintain and revitalize traditional relationships and uses for things like wild rice, a culturally important resource. And a shout out to Kristen Bland on our staff, who is one of the scientists working on this project. And then finally, another really inspiring project, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewas. This is not a Nature Conservancy project, being led by the Fond du Lac Band and the National Indian Carbon Coalition, looking at whether the way that the way the Fond du Lac Band is managing forests, whether that can be tweaked a little bit to store more carbon and potentially generate carbon credits that can be an additional revenue stream for the band. So stay tuned on that one. I want to just bring it all back together. This is a very quick run through where we've been and where we're going and how adaptation, natural climate solutions, and justice, equity, diversity, inclusion tie together. I would love, this is my last sort of plea, if you are interested in learning more about any of these facets of Nature Conservancy work, please have a look at our webpage. Our Changing Climate, developed by the amazing Alora Jones, our digital marketing strategist. It has background and information on all of these different projects and a bunch of other links. All right, so that's all I have for the formal presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and we should have some time left for conversation.
Wonderful, Meredith. Thank you so much for providing that presentation and such a thoughtful and comprehensive overview of the work that you and the TNC and your partners have been doing. Please, folks, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. That button is at the bottom of your screen. We do have one in here already asking about should city departments who are faced with limited budgets focus on improving the health quality of forests, so removing invasives or thinning overcrowded trees, or adding new trees, reforestation, urban forestry, or both, along with preserving open space, of course.
You know, that is such a good question. And I guess I have to say, Mindy, probably both. I do think that getting new trees established, especially in areas, and I know you're with the city of Duluth. I don't believe we have done any sort of analysis locally on tree equity, but just thinking about whether there are areas in town where having trees could make a big difference to the quality of life in those neighborhoods that don't have as many that can do things like shading and help with air quality and flooding, just all the heat island stuff. I almost feel like that needs to be a priority. I would have answered this question very differently 10 years ago. We certainly want to take care of our natural areas as well. And I know Duluth has a huge problem with, as most cities do, with buckthorn and other invasive species. However, those natural areas are providing some really, really important function for us. And they're already providing a number of important ecosystem services. So as I think about this and think about it, like what is the benefit to the human beings who live in our city, tree planting may be more of a priority. You could answer it the other way too, though. So,
thanks, Meredith. So I have a question that came up while you were talking about the spectrum of adaptation that you shared early on in the presentation, and it certainly seems like in your work and TNC's work, a lot of that has been on that upper end, but not all organizations are at that point, and not all people are at that point. And so kind of from your experience in moving from in different places in that spectrum, what kind of thoughts do you have or ideas for how to work with organizations that may be more resistant to kind of facilitated adaptation or some of that more transformational adaptation, as we are seeing more and more of the impacts of climate change, especially in the northern regions?
Yeah. So what I always come back to, and this is part of how the NIAC's adaptation menus have probably trained my brain, just thinking about what our goals are, because it's with that whole spectrum. It's not like to be at the transformation end of the spectrum is the goal, and it's not better than being on other parts of the spectrum. But so what is our goal? And what stands between us and being able to meet that goal? What are the kind of climate impacts? And so I feel like it's good to be skeptical about whether transformational change is needed in an ecosystem. I think it's also good to think about deploying strategies together that can complement each other. It's not an either or thing. So in our Northwoods, we have at least these two strategies available to us. And I think that that starting the process, just sort of looking at what the goal actually is, and then figuring out the pathway to get there is good. I think for any of us, just kind of keeping an open mind that we may need to shift our thinking about where we land on the spectrum is that's probably the biggest challenge. Yeah, I should probably leave it at that.
So there's another question that came in. It said many county land and forestry departments are still managing state trust lands with clear cutting, planting monocultures, and using herbicide in the understory. What can be done regarding plant rescue to preserve biodiversity and harvest wild type nursery materials of willows, blueberries, etc.?
Wow. Yeah, this is another example where I think we want to just kind of keep in mind what the goal is and how we best meet it. Let's see, I'm going to go open that tab again. There we go, because it disappeared from my questions, and I was like, oh, there was a lot to that question, so I want to be able to look. Well, let's see. So, sometimes clear cutting, planting monocultures, and using herbicides to obliterate the understory. I mean, if that helps get you where you need to be, then I suppose that's fine. But I think it's probably a good idea to take a look at whether that truly is getting us where we want to be, especially if we're trying to regenerate a species like aspen that may be one of the more challenged species by the climate warming that we are seeing. And then what can be done regarding plant rescue to preserve biodiversity and harvest wild type nursery materials? So this is an area where I guess I'm thinking less about plant rescue and more about the importance of wild seed collection, and maybe also cuttings and things like that, the establishment of seed orchards. But I do think that we want to be finding a way to curate and store this treasure trove of genetic variability across our state and across our nation in a very organized and comprehensive way. I think we really need to be thinking about how we do those collections and make these seeds available to future restoration and adaptation projects. So I guess I don't have like, I don't know of a network that's like, oh, there's going to be a harvest, we need to go and do plant rescue. But if we can be proactive and think about how we do these collections, I think that will be helpful.
So I have another question for you. So a lot of the intersection, there's a lot of intersection between the need for climate adaptation and conversations and movement on justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as you and the Nature Conservancy have recognized the need for this work at these intersections, what lessons are you learning that may be helpful for others who are starting along this path or maybe continuing or even are leaders on this path?
So I consider us to be at the very beginning of this journey as well. So I do not, I don't want to portray us as having figured any of this out. I think that where we need to start is partnering with and learning from organizations that have been doing climate justice work for a much longer time. And one of the groups that we've started talking with more about how we do this community engagement and outreach. We've had many conversations over the last, I would say 6 to 9 months as we try to learn, but Minnesota 350 has been a really important learning partner for us. And just to name one, and I feel like some of the things that we've uncovered have been actually captured in a working document that we're using as kind of our guiding principles. But first of all, just letting relationships develop and leading with those relationships, because we have tended as an organization to be extremely goal-oriented, as I just was talking about ironically moments ago, and not assuming that our goals are the right ones or that our strategies for getting there are the right ones. Listening much more than we are talking and trying to understand what is important to the partners in those places where we're trying to do the work. And yeah, I feel like we have a long ways to go here and we are not the experts. So the other piece of advice that has been given to us time and again, and will probably not be new to most of the people on this call, is the whole idea, the fundamental importance of bringing in partners at the very earliest stages of development, rather than having this almost ready to implement project that we're inviting people to come along on. And we do that time and again, and it's time to stop doing business that way.
Great, thank you. So there's a question that came in through the chat. So in the Minnesota Million, will open landscape habitats critical for wildlife such as prairie grouse be considered so trees are not planted in them, causing habitat fragmentation and abandonment by open landscape wildlife? In these areas, can TNC and partners focus on grassland restoration and other compatible carbon sequestration practices?
Yes, that is such an important point. And, you know, maybe another time we'll do a whole thing just on the Minnesota Million, because our intent is to avoid those areas that are critical for wildlife that depend on open habitat. And part of the mapping work that we've started, you know, we're at the very beginning stages, but we're excluding areas that are those important historically grassland dominated areas or shrublands that really ought not be converted to forests, but really focusing on those areas that may have historically supported forest cover and could reasonably do so again, using some suitability assessments and other tools that are available to us. But this is what we mean that, so 1 million acres is a lot. If we're doing this big GIS analysis, we could very well miss things. So if we say, hey, this looks like a really promising area to work, unless we're bringing in the local knowledge from people who know these areas really well and what wildlife habitat needs to be maintained a certain way, then we will have done a disservice to everybody. So that's a great point.
Great. Well, unless there are other questions that pop up here, I think we are at the end of our time. So Meredith, thank you again very much for joining us here today. I really appreciate the time, especially while you're on the road here. And congratulations again on receiving the NCAP award this year. Just for the broader folks on the call, our next webinar will be on Tuesday, July 20th, also from 12 to 1. That will be done in conjunction with the Twin Ports Climate Conversations group, which we discovered early on as holding their meetings the same time as these meetings. So this will be a chance for a little bit of overlap there. If you're not already subscribed to the email list, I will put the link here in the chat. And again, would certainly appreciate your completion of our evaluation if you haven't already done that, which I will also put in the chat, and you might go to that when you close out this window here. So Meredith, thank you again. I hope you have a good trip back.
Thank you. Just a real honor, and really appreciate the questions.